This is Rain Hamcast podcast number 69 for June 11th, 2022. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
Think about this. Auto-tune transmitter that can have full coverage from 3.95 to 26.5 megacycles and it tune to full output in 20 seconds. A conventional broadcast transmitter being used at the time probably would take at least 10 to 25 minutes and upwards of an hour to change to another frequency. So being able to move to a new frequency to counteract the jamming going on was a big advantage for the Voice of America. So Collins really scored on this one, 22nd to full output. Pretty remarkable.
In 1964, the Voice of America, VOA, commissioned Collins Radio to build three of its largest transmitters. The 821A1 was capable of transmitting an impressive 250 KW A.M. between 3.95 and 26.5 megahertz. Dennis Kidder, W6DQ, Secretary of the Collins Collectors Association, talked about the 821A1 during his virtual talk for the 2020 Ham Radio Expo. This is our second and last excerpt from that talk.
From what we could tell from the logs, each transmitter of the three averaged about 4 frequency changes a day. That was about right. And I mentioned before earlier, this was the most powerful shortwave broadcast transmitter ever offered by Collins Radio. So, in the last week of May in 2014, our team arrived at DeLano. The team consisted of Bill Carnes from CCA, Jim Stitzinger along with one of his employees from CCA, Vince Baker, who happened to be an employee of the Voice of America, which we were required to have a VOA representative on site whenever we were there. Vince was a great help. Rod Bloxam, K0DAS, a former employee of Collins Radio Company. He's retired, very familiar with this line of transmitters. He was one of the key engineers on their HF80 products, which derived a lot from this design. Scott Kerr from the Collins Collectors Association. I believe Scott was the president at the time, now that I think back about it. Brian Gurek, who is another CCA member. Dave Jennings, another CCA member and well-known AM amateur transmitter here on the west coast of the United States. He's got a beautiful station with a beautiful signal on 75 meters. Joe Knight came and joined us from the Southern California Antique Radio Society. And of course, me, Dennis W6DQ. So we started that relocation of DL8. So we enter the building. The two transmitters on the left-hand side, they're Harris. They're 50 kilowatt single sideband transmitters that are shut down. And then, of course, where Rod is standing is the doorway that goes into DL8. We had to cut the door out because the opening wasn't big enough to get the transmitter out to be able to carry it out back to the loading dock to load it into a truck. This is the actual PA assembly of the transmitter. That houses those two 4CV 100,000s. They're mounted in parallel in a water pot. Two are in a single pot. And the output from that goes up and to the left. Next view is of the modulator, and this also uses two of those 4CV 100,000s. These are in push-pull. Now, we're dealing with a quarter of a megawatt carrier, and things are bound to go wrong. We found a log entry. They were trying to tune the transmitter up on some specific frequency. We happened to notice some melted aluminum. Well, in the log entry, it says, try to tune up on like 20.5 megacycles. And in the notes, the engineer had written, don't ever do that again. We can only imagine that this is what happened. If you're going to open a panel up, you have to ground things. You have to make sure things are shunted to ground so that you don't get injured. There's the walk-in power supply. A plate transformer on the left. On the opposite side are the modulator transformers. There's a modulator plate supply. There's a modulation transformer and a modulator inductor. There's rectifiers and filter capacitors and all kinds of stuff in here. This is pretty amazing. This thing is gigantic. The thing that looks like a water heater off on the right, that's a utility transformer. It takes like 4,000 volts, three-phase, and turns it into basically single-phase 220 and 110 for utility use around the transmitter. So moving outside, the exterior of the transmitter hall, those parallel feed lines coming out, they feed into an antenna switch yard, several as a matter of fact. You can see one of those 200-foot towers. You can see another couple of towers in the background there. All the feed lines going out to some of the other antennas, all those telephone poles going out to the right, and a lot of stuff going out to the left. This is several of their what are called dipole curtain arrays. They're basically just a series of dipoles that are interconnected vertically and horizontally in a matrix, and it allows you to tune this antenna over a wide frequency range and also steer it a bit. You can change direction and you can change the angle of departure. Those are the three original towers after they built that first rhombic. You can see this quite easily from Highway 99, and it's miles away. This is the medium wave and shortwave array. The 4 tall towers are 400 feet tall, and that's the medium wave array. The 3 shorter ones, along with part of that one 400-foot tower, form the shortwave array. And these are, again, dipole curtain arrays. Well, we wrapped up our tour of the antenna farm and went back. Back at the facility, what do we got? An empty room. Everything's cleaned up. Everything's been moved out. Everything's been palletized. And the next step was the load out. This is DL8's new home. This is at the Antique Wireless Association Museum located in New York. And they've done just a magnificent job of putting this transmitter back on display. I hope that everyone here could someday get a chance to go and visit the museum. AWA is a tremendous organization. They do a lot to preserve the history of radio in general, but now they're contributing to the preservation of Collins Radio's 821A1 from Voice of America DeLano relay site. DLA. Thanks to Antique Wireless Association for putting this on display and working with us to make this happen. And last but not least, thanks to Eric and QSO Today Ham Radio Expo for allowing me to come here and share our story. It was a lot of fun. What comes next? Questions and answers. Were the other transmitters scrapped? Yes and no. You know, Bethany, I said, was turned into a museum. So they've got some of the hardware there. The Voice of America Museum in Bethany, Ohio, they have transmitters there. And yes, everything in Dixon was hauled off and scrapped. The site was purchased by a farmer. He surplused out were literally tons and tons of copper pipe that were used for feed lines. So he probably made a small fortune on that copper. The museum is in New York I had to think about the name of the city. I think it's Bloomfield is where they're located. They used to be in Rochester, but they moved. So they're in Bloomfield now, if I remember correctly. Can you rent time on the existing VOA antennas? I wish. We took a KW A.M. 380 with us, and our intention was to put one of the big curtain arrays on the air.
You are listening to our second excerpt from the 2020 Ham Radio Expo virtual talk given by Dennis Kidder, W6TQ, about the Voice of America and the Collins 821A1 mega transmitter. We'll continue that talk in a moment after you ID your station. This is Rain Hamcast podcast number 69 for June 11th, 2022. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, and you're tuned into the Radio Amateur Information Network. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Rain Hamcast on the rainreport.com and on the Rain Report page on YouTube.
Unfortunately, somebody broke into the site one night while we were there, soon after we arrived, and they stole a bunch of the copper feed line. It's basically like 1.5-inch, 2-inch copper pipe. And there's literally thousands of feet of this stuff. And they came in there with a buzzsaw and just cut all this stuff out and hauled it away. So we really weren't able to get onto the antenna. We couldn't initiate the switch yard, and we couldn't really get to the antennas with the radio to put it on the air. But boy, we'd love to do that. I have to thank you for what you guys did at Collins and what you do out there still today. It's quite an amazing company over the years. I'm actually a member of the board of directors of the Collins Collectors Association, also the secretary. So, yeah, I have quite a passion for Collins. I've been collecting it for over 50 years. I have a 75S3 here that I originally purchased in 1969. So I've had this stuff a long time. Taking apart is one thing. How did it get back together at the other side, and how long did it take? It was completed within the 18 months, and we had some pretty detailed documentation that we made on the process of disassembly. All the components were all labeled and were given ID numbers. We had a full set of manuals and all of the engineering drawings for the transmitter. So that helped a lot, being able to put things back together. It was a real erector set. Let's see, Armed Forces Radio and Television Service used VOA sites. I'm not sure about that. I do know that the Voice of America, before they had their own sites, used the BBC in England, as well as, I think it was CBS here in California, located up in the Bay Area, to transmit out to the Pacific Theater.
What is or was your profession?
I am a retired system engineer in aerospace industry. Did that for about 45 years. I retired in 2012, and I've been enjoying it ever since, playing radio and getting married and settling down in the high desert here in California, raising antennas on our 5-acre antenna farm.
What kind of crew did they have at the VOA to maintain all that equipment? And did they have spares? Were there spare tubes sitting out there also?
Oh, yeah. And now, as for the personnel, I really don't have the details on their staffing. I don't know how many people they actually had there. There was really not a lot of evidence of that. As for spares, there was lots and lots of spares. We took a lot of the spare parts to AWA Museum. Some of the 4CD 100,000 Cs are on display with a little storage cart that they use to move them around. And all of the hardware, those little pulley assemblies, the little winch assemblies, we've got some of those back there on display. I know that at least one of the tubes, probably more, were given to some folks from Collins Radio. I think Michael Collins may have gotten some of that, Art Collins' son. He was a big part of helping us make this happen. DeLano's site is still standing. All the towers are still up. The buildings are still standing. And it was just a fluke. It was all to be demolished and put into a landfill. California Department of Fish and Game discovered there's an endangered species living on the property, the 800-acre plus acre site. And it's some little tiny thing that only lives there. And they said, nope, you can't do anything here. You can't knock these towers down. You can't knock the buildings down. So DeLano Relay got a stay of execution, at least for a while. So if you drive up or down Highway 99 between Bakersfield and Fresno and go through the town of DeLano and look off to the west, you'll see the antenna farm out there. It is a huge site on the horizon out there. It's just amazing. The VOA has a website. If you Google Voice of America, I've gotten a lot of information from their site. A lot of the photographs that we used, a lot of the detailed information came from the Voice of America. And mentioning Jim Stitzinger, one of the interesting things that occurred is that with the budget cuts in government, Voice of America was tasked with getting rid of a lot of their archives. And Jim Stitzinger offered to take some of it. Imagine his surprise when a truckload full of pallets full of documentation from the Voice of America showed up. And going through that material, we found a lot of old photographs of the construction of the DeLano site. Just really neat stuff that's probably going to be put in the recycle bin, unfortunately, but Jim was lucky enough to get a hold of it. I think the hope is to have some of that stuff online someday for display. Stay tuned for that. I couldn't even begin to hazard a guess. There's got to be miles and miles and miles of that 2-inch copper tubing, which are basically used as phasing lines, the switching sections. They use cable to get from the transmitter building out to the switch yards and from the switch yards out to the antennas. But they've got these huge phasing yards. They're basically big switched phasing arrays that feed the antennas. And these are multiple wavelengths of copper pipe. There's just hundreds and hundreds of lines. They're literally hundreds of feet long. So there's literally got to be miles of that stuff out there. Of course, none of it can be touched now because of the endangered species. But like I say, the farmer up in Dixon, he probably made a small fortune. I would wager to say he didn't pay a lot for the property. It was sold off at auction. I think he probably made a fortune selling off the copper. One of the things he was trying to sell were the rhombic antennas. We got word. He says, hey, you want to buy a rhombic? Yeah, I'd love to have one of those rhombics. I'd love to have 2 or 3 of them. But, tearing them down and putting them up again, I'd take a lot more than 5 acres to put some of that stuff in the air. Everything's gone to satellite and internet. It's sad that we've lost all that technology. I dare say that today I think it would be hard to be able to build a station like that. I don't know that we have the engineering. That antenna array is quite a piece of engineering. I wonder if we've lost the bubble on doing that with all the stuff that we do today.
Is there documentation on those antennas, and can they be scaled to the ham bands?
Sure. If you think about it, those antennas were actually in the ham bands. Those are all HF. And they operated all throughout the HF spectrum and the medium frequency spectrum. They don't have to be scaled. They're already there, but they're ginormous. They're huge. As for documentation, the company that built the big phase dipole curtain arrays, I can't think of the name of the company. They're still in business. I don't know that they have actually built anything like that recently. There's a lot of that being built in Europe. There are shortwave broadcasters in Europe that use these big dipole curtain arrays. And I think some of the astounding stuff about that is that they build dipole curtain arrays that are rotatable. So it'll have a central mast that can rotate and booms sticking out that hold the curtain. To me, that's just phenomenal. A lot of engineering going on there. But, we have all the engineering drawings and documentation from the antenna farm. We do have all of that. One of the things in my library, Jim gave me a full set of documents on the 821A1, the theory of operation and all the assembly and actually operating the thing, how it works and how it was put together, the maintenance manuals. It's a shelf of books like, 3-ring binders. It's probably about 3 feet long.
And that's a wrap for this Rain Hamcast podcast number 69 for June 11th, 2022, in which we brought you our final excerpt from a talk from the virtual 2020 Ham Radio Expo. We heard from Dennis Kidder, W6DQ, Secretary of the Collins Collectors Association, CCA, talking about the Collins 821A1 250 kilowatt mega transmitter and the Voice of America. Rain founder Hap Holly, KC9RP, edits and produces this bi-weekly Ham Radio Hamcast without monetization. Your support and feedback are welcome on the rainreport.com and via PayPal. Rain programming is made available under a Creative Commons license. You are encouraged to download, share, post, and transmit the Rain Hamcast in its entirety via amateur radio. Thanks to Tom Shimizu, N9JDI, for his assistance with the Rain Report channel on YouTube. Rain Hamcast podcast number 70 will post June 25th, 2022. The Radio Amateur Information Network is copyright 1985-2022 Rain. All rights are reserved. Very 73 from the Radio Amateur Information Network. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR. Keep on hamming.